4 amazing courses on the Bible that are probably not being offered at your local seminary. This time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. According to my YouTube demographics, 97% of the people who watch this channel are male. And of those, 78% are between the ages of 18 and 44. This means that a rather sizable amount of my viewing audience either has been to seminary or is in seminary or is considering going to seminary. In fact, on my weekly live streams, I usually get 1 or 2 questions every other week asking about what is it like to go to seminary, or how did I make it through seminary while holding a full-time job. So I get a lot of questions about seminary. But one of the questions I have not received that I think is really worth mentioning was, what were the 4 greatest courses I took while I was at seminary? And when I reflect upon what were the best classes I ever took, these weren't the core courses. These weren't stuff like Hebrew and Greek, which I think should absolutely be part of a seminary curricula. Like, for example, I think every seminary that's worth its salt should have 3 years of Greek and 2 years of Hebrew at the very minimum. And I think that there is a need for those core curricula. But I also think, too, that the 4 courses that were most influential on my training was actually the electives. So, what we're going to do today is we are going to discuss the 4 electives I took at seminary that had the most profound significance in my thinking and my thought processes, but also why these courses aren't normally offered at most seminaries. Because it's while these courses were excellent in every regard, excellent in content, had excellent instruction, had really made you think and engage the Bible, they also aren't courses that are typically taught at a seminary. So we're going to get into this. We're going to get into the meat of these 4 great seminary courses that your seminary is probably not going to offer, but should. Now, the first course is a course on the spirit world. I have to admit, lately, with the work of Dr. Michael Heiser, a lot of more interest has now been placed on the spirit world. But the course I took was back in 2008. This is pre-Heiser. But we had to teach this course with the doors closed. Now, this is very unusual for where I went, because in most of the classes I took, at least some of the time, the doors of the class were open. This is the only class I ever took where the doors were always closed. And they were always closed because it's scary. There was always this fear that students would hear what was being discussed in the class, who were not part of the class, and react negatively towards that. There is sort of this expectation when you go to a Christian seminary that you're going to be kind of in this sort of protected Christian bubble. And this class is definitely not it. Because, we talked about things like angelic appearances, demonic possession, witchcraft and magic. We talked about things such as lycanthropy, shape-shifting, and Native American spirituality. We discussed things such as vampirism, ghosts and communicating with the dead. Is it possible? Is it biblical? How is it done? What is the materiality of the soul? Is the soul generated from birth, or are you created with it? These are all aspects of the spirit world. What is the hierarchy of spiritual beings? How does that all work? How does one conduct an exorcism? These are things that are, part of engaging the spirit realm. So it's a very, very relevant course, but it's also a course not likely to be offered at your seminary because it frightens people. It frightens students, it frightens administration, and it probably is going to only appeal to a very small group of people, which is unfortunate because it's also incredibly useful. It was one of the best courses I ever took when I was at seminary. The second course I think that should be offered, and often isn't, is a course on new religious movements. Now, when I took the course on new religious movements, there was always this perception by the administration, by the faculty who ran the school, that it was redundant. You don't need a course on new religious movements. Oh heck, just give them Jesus. Just give them some verses from the New Testament Gospels. That's enough. That's enough to convince any pagan of the sufficiency of Christ, and that should be enough. Well, you know what? It's not. Because you don't know if those texts are meeting a particular need. What a properly conducted course on new religious movements does is it teaches you how to understand and listen and really hear what people in other religious movements are saying. And frankly, back in the 1970s, cults and the occult were all the hot things. And some of this was because a lot of apologists with pulpit ministries out there that, really sort of beat the pavement, warning about cults. But you also had a lot of hucksters. And those people ended up damaging the intellectual pursuit of trying to learn more about these new religious movements. You had, complete frauds like Mike Warnke, all the way to dilettantes who had no credentials at all, but just saw cults in the occult as a means of making a name for themselves. And those amateur efforts sort of tainted the field so that today it's now just the focus of a very, very small group of dedicated scholars. And I think that's unfortunate. I think it's really unfortunate. And I think it's unfortunate because the fact is that the influence of new religious movements is just simply grown. It's exploded right under the church's nose, and the church doesn't even realize that this is happening. And in many cases, these new religious movements are actually recruiting from the Christian church. And we're just sort of oblivious to it. We have sort of a laissez-faire, people come, people go attitude that we don't even realize that they're coming in the door and then leaving for these movements. So in order to understand how all of this is happening, we do need to study new religious movements. So I think it's very, very important that people at seminary also get a good grounding. It's more than just Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. It's a huge number of different movements. You've got everything from UFO cults like the Raelians to new inner city movements like the Conscious Community, or even as we discovered as I was studying new religious movements, a whole sort of society of vampire cults that were basically breakaway splinter cults from, and I hate to say this, mainstream neo-paganism like Wicca. Like, one of the things I discovered when I was studying new religious movements was that many of the people who had become part of vampire cults were actually formerly in, say, white witchcraft or Wicca. And they had become sort of, jaded. They sort of viewed, Wicca and white witchcraft as being sort of a Christian hater society, when what they were desiring was a deeper spirituality. And they found that deeper spirituality in the drinking of blood. So there's a lot here that can be learned just so that we can engage these new religious groups in a more meaningful way. But we can't do that until we start actually studying them. This is why I think courses in new religious movements at the seminary level are so important, because it gives us another tool for which we can engage the culture. Okay, the third really, really great course that I took that I think should be offered at every seminary, and probably isn't, is the geography of the Bible. Now, part of this has to do with a cultural thing that we have in North America. In North America, we tend to be atopic. And atopia means no place. It's the idea that we don't really need geography or to know about place to get along in our world. There's been lots of these little vignettes on Jay Leno, where they try to show a map of the United States, and they get some guy on the street and point out, "Oh, what's the name of that state? You can't name that state? Wow, interesting. That's Alaska." Stuff like that. This is the ignorance of, say, the North American population concerning geography is almost infamous. In fact, if you learned geography in high school at all, statistics say that you were most likely taught geography by your 10th grade gym teacher. It has that low of a priority in our school system. So now we get people who are going to college who know nothing about world geography. And now those people go on and get a master's degree at a seminary, and now they have to do exposition of the Bible. You go to any seminary, and you'll probably see maybe half dozen courses on history, but not a single course on geography. That's really telling. Because geography really, really matters as far as the Bible is concerned. It really matters. The flow of troops in the ancient Near East follows geography. The way that people invaded the Holy Land followed geography. Where is the Reed Sea, the so-called Red Sea? That's a question of geography. How did the Israelites leave Egypt? That's a question of geography. How did the Israelites enter the Holy Land? That's a matter of geography. Where were the battles between the Philistines and the Davidic kingdom? That's a very important piece of geography. The voyage of Paul. That's an important piece of geography. You can go over this over and over and over again. The life of Christ. He's a peripatetic preacher. He wanders the Holy Land. How did the geography of Israel change over time? Because it did, dramatically. The Israel of today is very, very different geographically than the Israel of ancient times. In ancient times, Israel was completely divided down the center by a swamp. Almost nobody today knows that. The cities of the Philistines on the coastal plain were separated from the Israelites in the Judean foothills by a swamp. Geography is incredibly important to our understanding of the Bible. Because you have to understand that things are not didn't just sort of happen as the crow flies. Today, we're so used to the planes and automobiles that we don't even understand that our perspective of the world has been altered by rapid transit like that. In the ancient world, if two towns were separated by 2 kilometers, they were considered 2 distinct and totally separate towns. Today, we get in a car, 2 kilometers, bing, 30 seconds go by and you're past it. It's completely distorted our sense of geography. So I think it is really, really, really important for a Bible exegete to understand the geography of the ancient world. And I think it's really, really unfortunate that most seminaries don't offer a course on the geography of the Holy Land, but it really, really needs to happen because there's so much dependent on it. Okay, the 4th course that should be offered at your seminary, and probably isn't, is text criticism of the Old Testament. Now, the reason why it's not offered is because it's hard. Text criticism of the New Testament is often offered at seminaries, and that's because it's easy. It's straightforward. It's really tidy. You've got a lot of papyri that are really, really close. It's really easy to put things together. That's not quite the case with text criticism of the Old Testament. And unlike, say, the New Testament, where you're dealing primarily with just one language, you're dealing primarily with Greek. With text criticism of the Old Testament, for students to even be able to do the course competently, they have to know both Greek and Hebrew, minimum. It's preferable if they have even more languages. But they need just those 2 just to be competent. And the person teaching it has to be very, very meticulous, precise. There's a lot involved here, a lot of moving parts. And you have to be really, really comfortable with ambiguity. Text criticism of the Old Testament is messy. If you want an instant answer from Old Testament lower text criticism, and that's really what we're talking about here. We're not talking about like higher criticism, like the documented hypothesis or source criticism. We're talking here about lower text criticism. But it's a very technical field. There's few teachers who can teach it well. It's difficult, complicated, and it's a lot of work. A lot of work for the teachers, a lot of work for the students. However, with all of that said, it teaches a skill that is absolutely invaluable for both pastors and pastor scholars and people who are going to go on to be full scholars. It teaches you skills that'll last you a lifetime. It gets you introduced to all these various text sources, like, say, the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Septuagint, the Masoretic text, the fragments of the Wadi Mirabat. There's all these little sources that can play into this, that you are now starting to be introduced to. And it gives you a great methodology for actually taking these sources and trying to figure out what the original autographs of the Bible actually said. It also gives you a tool set that you could use if you go on to greater scholarship. I mean, let's say you go on and you do, say, work outside the Bible entirely. Let's say you do it in, say, the coffin texts of ancient Egypt. Well, you've got 1,000 coffin texts to deal with. How do you determine what's the original coffin text? Well, you can do that same method of lower text criticism using the Egyptian language. The same sort of methods apply. It's a wonderful set of skills. You could use this, say, for example, in tracing down ancestral DNA. You could use the same methodologies here. The same logic you learn for doing lower text criticism of the Old Testament applies to other fields. So it's a great, great skill. It's an absolutely invaluable skill to have. And plus it gives you this toolkit to be able to handle the ancient texts competently. So I think lower text criticism, essentially text criticism of the Old Testament, is absolutely a invaluable class to offer at a seminary, but it's unfortunate that very, very few seminaries actually offer it because it is difficult to do. So that is my roundup of 4 great courses that should be offered at a seminary. And to summarize, they're often not offered because they're seen as scary, redundant, unimportant, or hard. But this is really unfortunate because they're great. They're the sort of courses that can really change your perspective of the world. And they should be offered at every seminary. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this and got something out of this. And I'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.